There is a very specific kind of pain that happens after you leave an avoidant. It is not loud at first. It does not arrive like a dramatic ending, with slammed doors and final speeches and someone collapsing in tears. It arrives like a room that suddenly has no echo, a phone that stays dark, a morning that feels too still, a silence so clean it almost makes you question whether anything between you was ever real at all. And that is what hurts the most. Not just losing them, but losing them in a way that makes you feel invisible. Because when an avoidant pulls away, it can feel like you were the only one bleeding. Like you were the only one awake inside the relationship. Like you were the one carrying the tenderness, the overthinking, the waiting, the attempts to repair, the swallowing of pride, the midnight rewrites of messages you never sent. And then when you finally leave, when you finally choose yourself, they do not chase, they do not beg, they do not perform grief in a way your nervous system can recognize. So your mind begins torturing you. Maybe they never cared. Maybe you meant nothing. Maybe they already detached long before you walked away. Maybe your absence is a relief. And that is the trap. Because what looks like indifference is often something far more complicated, far more human, far more devastating. The brutal truth is this: if you stayed too long trying to get an avoidant to love you correctly, you may have trained yourself to mistake pursuit for powerlessness. You may have started believing that if you just explained yourself one more time, loved harder one more time, stayed calmer one more time, they would finally feel safe enough to stay open. But every time you ran toward their distance, you fed the very dynamic that kept you starving. Your urgency became the emotional pressure they could not metabolize. Your closeness, even when pure, landed in their body like demand. And the more they sensed your fear of losing them, the more their system interpreted connection as a place where they could drown. That is the part no one tells you enough. Avoidants are not always cold because they do not feel. They are often cold because they feel too much, too fast, with too few internal tools to regulate what intimacy awakens in them. Their body learns to treat emotional closeness like a threat long before their mind can explain it. Their nervous system reads vulnerability as exposure. Their amygdala, that ancient alarm system in the brain, starts firing not because you are dangerous, but because closeness itself has been coded as danger. The moment love begins to require sustained presence, accountability, emotional access, their cortisol rises, their body moves into self-protection, and distance starts to feel like relief. This is why they can miss you and still not reach out. This is why they can care and still go numb. This is why they can love in fragments and then disappear inside themselves. Not because nothing is happening, because too much is happening. When you were there, their system was constantly managing the weight of your presence, your feelings, their guilt, your needs, their fear of failing you, your hope, their shame. The silent pressure of being seen by someone who wanted more closeness than they knew how to survive. So they detached not always out of cruelty, but out of overwhelm. Emotional overwhelm. Neurological overwhelm. A private flood they rarely know how to name. And here is where the power shifts in a way most people do not understand. While you are still there, they can regulate themselves through distance, a delayed text, a vague answer, a change of topic, a retreat into work, sleep, stress, distractions, habits, anything that keeps them from sitting inside the naked intensity of connection. But when you leave for real, when your energy is no longer circling them, when your voice stops reaching, when your sadness is no longer accessible to them as background noise, the structure changes. Now there is no one to push against, no one to mute, no one to calm down later, no one to keep slightly close while remaining emotionally far. And that is often when their silent regret begins. Not always instantly, not in the romantic, cinematic way people fantasize about, but slowly, internally, in fragments. Because silence does something powerful to an avoidant. Real silence, not performative silence, not silence used as bait, not silence that is secretly screaming, "Please notice me." I mean the kind of silence that happens when someone has finally stopped abandoning themselves in order to be understood. That silence removes pressure. And when the pressure disappears, so does the avoidance excuse for staying numb. For the first time, they are left alone with what they could not feel while you were still available. This is the paradox. Your presence overwhelmed them. Your absence reveals them. At first, they may seem completely fine, maybe even lighter, maybe more social, more active, more normal than you expected. And if you see that, it can destroy you for a while, because your brain will immediately translate their surface calm into proof that you never mattered. But surface calm is not inner peace. Sometimes it is just delayed processing. Sometimes the avoidant does not feel the loss when the loss happens. They feel it when the nervous system finally becomes quiet enough to register what is missing. When the dopamine spikes from distraction wear off. When the novelty of freedom fades. When the body reaches for the familiar regulation of your attention and realizes it is gone. Gone, gone. Not waiting, not checking, not hoping. Gone. And that is when memory becomes louder than defense. They remember your softness at strange times. In the grocery store, in traffic, in the middle of laughing with other people. They remember the look on your face the last time you asked for honesty. They remember the warmth of being loved by someone who kept trying, even when they gave you so little to hold. They remember your rituals, your phrasing, the way you made space for their contradictions. And these memories do not arrive as romance first. They often arrive as irritation, restlessness, insomnia, emotional static. Because regret does not always say, "I miss them." Sometimes regret says, "Why does everything feel off? Why am I checking their profile? Why do I suddenly want to text at 1:12 a.m.? Why does no one else feel familiar? Why do ordinary conversations feel so empty? Why do I keep replaying the moment they left?" That is silent regret. It does not always kneel at your door. Sometimes it paces inside theirs. And this is where most people make the mistake that resets the entire pattern. They sense the shift. They feel the crack in the wall. They notice the breadcrumb, the late-night message, the vague, just checking in, the story view, the sudden curiosity, the tiny signal that maybe, finally, the avoidant is feeling something. And because their own wound is still open, they rush to fill the space. They answer too quickly. They over-explain. They turn one small opening into emotional access. They hand the avoidant relief before the lesson has fully reached the nervous system. And just like that, the pattern starts breathing again. This is why silence is not a strategy. It is a transformation. If you use silence as manipulation, your body is still orbiting them. If you use silence as punishment, you are still emotionally fused to the outcome. But if silence becomes self-return, everything changes. Because now your energy is no longer saying, "Please choose me." It is saying, "I choose myself, even in the absence of your understanding." That is what an avoidant feels, not your performance, your withdrawal of emotional labor. They feel the missing access, the missing reassurance, the missing bridge. And what begins to unsettle them is not simply your absence. It is the realization that your love was once a place they could return to without fully earning it. A place they assumed would remain open, warm, available, forgiving. And when that place closes, not in bitterness, but in self-respect, they are forced to confront something they spend much of the life avoiding: consequences. Not dramatic consequences, emotional ones. The consequence of not saying what they felt. The consequence of turning away instead of turning inward. The consequence of confusing control with safety. The consequence of choosing distance so often that eventually, distance chooses them back. Imagine them on an ordinary night, their phone in their hand, a message box open. Your name still familiar enough to send a shock through the chest. They type something casual. Delete it. Type something softer. Delete it. They want contact, but not exposure. They want reassurance, but not vulnerability. They want to know if you still care, without having to face the full weight of how little they protected what you gave. So they do nothing. Again. And then the silence deepens. But now it is different, because this time they know it is not your silence that created the emptiness. It is theirs. That realization can haunt a person, especially the avoidant who told themselves they just needed space, just needed less pressure, just needed someone easier, calmer, less emotional, less deep, less complicated. Because eventually they discover that the problem was not that you felt too much. The problem was that intimacy asked them to feel too. And that was the mountain. You have to understand this clearly, or you will keep romanticizing their withdrawal. They did not stop caring. They stopped coping. There is a difference. Caring lives in the heart. Coping lives in the nervous system. And the nervous system is stronger than intention when someone has never learned how to stay open under emotional strain. So yes, after you leave, their silent regret often begins. But not because some magical rule of detachment suddenly makes everyone come running. And not because every avoidant turns into a poet once abandoned. It begins because your absence removes the emotional scaffolding they took for granted. Because what they suppressed during connection now has room to surface. Because the human body keeps score, and even the most defended people eventually feel the outline of what once held them. But here is the part that matters most. Their regret is not your reward. Read that again inside yourself. Their regret is not your reward. Because if you are still waiting for them to suffer in a way that validates your pain, then they are still controlling your healing. If your self-worth depends on whether they come back confused, remorseful, softer, more available, then you are still standing in the same emotional house that broke you. The real shift happens when their regret becomes irrelevant to your identity. When you no longer need their delayed awakening to confirm that you were lovable. When you stop measuring your value by how long it takes someone emotionally unavailable to admit your absence mattered. When you understand that being deeply felt by someone is not the same as being deeply chosen by them. That is the difference that changes lives. Some avoidants do come back, but many come back with longing, not capacity. Missing you is not the same as being able to hold you. Thinking about you is not the same as being able to repair. Regret is not the same as readiness. And if you do not understand that, you will mistake emotional movement for emotional growth. You will hear softness and assume safety. You will see attention and assume commitment. You will feel chemistry and call it change. Be careful. An avoidant in regret can become intensely drawn to the person they lost, not because they are suddenly transformed, but because loss reactivates attachment without requiring true intimacy at first. The chase can feel easier than the relationship. Wanting you from a distance can feel safer than loving you up close. Fantasy is easy. Sustained emotional presence is the real test. So if they return, do not just listen to their words. Listen to your body. Does your nervous system feel steadier or merely activated? Do they offer clarity or just contact? Do they take responsibility or just express confusion? Do they move toward discomfort or only toward access? That distinction will save you, because the old version of you would have accepted being missed as proof of meaning. The new version of you requires alignment. No more translating silence into devotion. No more calling inconsistency depth. No more turning crumbs into sacred evidence that they cared. You are allowed to tell the truth now. Yes, they may regret losing you. Yes, they may feel your absence more deeply than they ever let you see. Yes, they may replay your love in private and wonder why they could not receive it while it was in front of them. And still, that does not mean you were meant to stay available for their unfinished healing. Your life cannot become a waiting room for someone else's nervous system to mature. That is not love. That is suspension. There is a moment, after enough grief, when something fierce and quiet begins to grow inside you. Not because the pain disappears, but because you finally see what the pain was trying to teach you. That you were never too much for needing reciprocity. That your sensitivity was not the burden. That your desire for honesty, tenderness, consistency, and emotional presence was not excessive. It was healthy. It was relational. It was brave. You were not hard to love. You were just handed to someone who experienced real closeness as pressure. And that misalignment can wound you deeply if you personalize it. But it can also wake you up. Because now you know the difference between being wanted and being safe. Between chemistry and capacity. Between someone feeling you deeply and someone building with you steadily. That knowledge is power. Quiet power. The kind that does not beg to be recognized. The kind that does not collapse when someone withdraws. The kind that no longer interprets another person's emotional limitation as a verdict on your worth. So if you have left an avoidant, and the silence is making you question everything, hear this carefully. Their stillness is not proof that you meant nothing. Their delay is not proof that your love was invisible. Their silence may be the very place where regret is beginning to form. But let it form without you. Let them sit with the shape of what they lost. Let them meet the echo of their own defenses. Let them discover, in their own time, that pushing away someone genuine does not create freedom. Sometimes it creates emptiness with better lighting. And you? You keep walking. You do not walk because you never loved them. You walk because you finally love yourself enough not to disappear inside someone else's fear. That is the identity shift. Not, I hope they come back changed, but I am no longer available for love that requires me to shrink, chase, decode, or bleed for basic emotional presence. That is power, not coldness, not revenge, not detachment performed from a wounded ego. Real power. The kind born when your self-worth stops negotiating with silence. The kind born when your nervous system learns that abandonment is not always something done to you. Sometimes it is something you stop doing to yourself. The kind born when you realize you were never asking for too much. You were asking the wrong person to meet you in the right place. And now, finally, you do not need them to understand your value for it to be real. You do not need their regret to complete your story. You do not need their return to reverse your pain. You do not need their apology to become whole. Because the moment you stopped chasing someone who could only love you from behind emotional glass, something sacred happened. You came back to yourself. And once that happens, everything changes. Now, if they think about you, they are thinking about someone who left with dignity. Someone who stopped translating neglect into hope. Someone who refused to confuse longing with love. Someone whose absence now carries weight because their presence once carried so much grace. Let them feel that. Let them wonder. Let them miss. Let them sit in the silence they once used to protect themselves and discover that it no longer protects them from loss. But you? You are no longer waiting in that silence to be chosen. You are becoming someone who chooses herself so completely that even if regret blooms in their chest, it does not reopen the door to your old hunger. That version of you is different, steadier, softer with herself, harder to manipulate, impossible to erase. And that is when the story truly ends. Not when they regret you, when you outgrow the need for them to.